England has tens of thousands of towns. Most of them look the same now. The same coffee chain on the corner, the same bank turned into the same glass-fronted phone shop, the same supermarket on the same ring road, the same retail park, the same high street that you could photograph in Cornwall and in Carlisle and not be able to tell them apart. That is what modernisation did. It did not just update these places, it made them interchangeable. But there are a small number of towns where it never happened. Not towns pretending, not film sets, not heritage parks with a turnstile and a gift shop and a man in costume telling you how people used to live. Real towns. Towns where someone bought their newspaper this morning from a shop that has looked exactly the same since rationing ended. Where the butcher is still a butcher. Where the cinema still has an usherette. Where you can stand in the middle of the street, turn a full circle and find nothing, not one single thing that tells you what decade you are standing in. No chain logo, no contactless sign in the window. A hand-painted shop front that was last repainted the same colour it has always been. People live here. They are not performing. This is just Tuesday. England has roughly 10,000 designated conservation areas. A handful of towns go far beyond that. Places where the modern world simply never arrived, or arrived and was turned away at the edge of town. This list covers 8 of them, ranked from quietly old-fashioned to genuinely difficult to believe still exists. And by number 1, the idea that a town has to modernise to survive, that progress is just something that happens to a place whether it likes it or not, is going to feel like something you were told, but never actually questioned. Entry 8, Southwold, Suffolk. On the Suffolk coast, about 2 hours from London, sitting on a spit of land hemmed in by the North Sea, the River Blyth, and a creek called Buss Creek. Population just under 3,000. There is one road in and out. You approach Southwold across a bridge over the river, and the moment you cross it, the chains fall away and do not come back. The high street is independent shops, almost all the way down. A jeweller, an antiques dealer, a shop that does nothing but sell amber. A market on Mondays and Thursdays in the same square it has always been held in. Someone lives here. This is the part that gets skipped. Southwold is not a museum of seaside England. It is seaside England, still operating. The town's anchor is Adnams, the brewery, founded in 1872 on a site where beer has been brewed since 1396, more than 600 years of brewing on the same ground. Every morning the smell of hops drifts across the rooftops. And then there is the detail that tells you exactly what kind of place this is. The Electric Picture Palace, a 70-seat cinema built to recreate the experience of going to the pictures in the middle of the 20th century. A commissionaire greets you at the door, an usherette shows you to your seat with a torch. Whether you call that nostalgia or preservation is up to you. What is documented is the lighthouse, built in 1890, still operational, standing white and absurd right in the middle of the town among the houses. And the beach huts, rows of them, painted every colour, which are so sought after that one was put on the market for £250,000. A shed on a beach for the price of a flat. The trade-off is that Southwold is gentle and gentleness is expensive. This is now one of the most costly places to buy a home in Suffolk. The town never modernised, and the reward for never modernising is that the rest of the country decided it wanted exactly this and bid the price of it out of reach. You live in the thing everyone else is on a waiting list to visit. Entry 7, Clovelly, Devon. On the North Devon coast, clinging to a cliff above Bideford Bay, there is no real population figure that means anything here because the village is barely bigger than the cliff it is built on, around 80 cottages tumbling down a single street so steep it has steps cut into it. Here is the thing about that street. You cannot drive on it. No car has ever driven down the main street of Clovelly because the main street of Clovelly is a staircase of cobbles dropping several hundred feet to the harbour. Goods come down by sledge, a wooden sledge dragged by hand or historically pulled by donkeys. The rubbish goes back up the same way, and this is not a show put on for visitors. It is simply how the village works, because it is the only way the village can work. Someone lives here. They get their shopping home on a sledge. Clovelly is also one of the strangest survivals on this list because it is privately owned. The entire village, every cottage, the harbour, 2,000 acres around it now, belongs to one family estate. The Hamlin family has owned and run it since 1738, and the village has been in the hands of just 3 families since the 13th century. In the early 20th century, Christine Hamlin devoted herself to restoring the cottages one by one and built a car park at the top of the hill specifically to keep the cars out. Almost every building on that cobbled street is now individually listed. According to a lurid 18th century pamphlet, Clovelly was once the lair of a tribe of cannibal robbers led by a man named Greg, who supposedly committed 1,000 murders before being hunted down and burned alive. There is a stretch of the bay still called the Devil's Kitchen. Whether any of that is true, it almost certainly is not, is beside the point. What is true is the sledge, the cobbles, the donkeys, the 80 listed cottages, and the fact that one family has held all of it for nearly 300 years and refused to let the road in. The trade-off is that you live in a postcard with no door a vehicle can reach. Every bag of coal, every delivery, every piece of furniture comes down a cliff by hand. The thing that makes Clovelly Clovelly, its refusal of the car, is also the thing you carry on your back up a hill, in the rain, in February, when the tourists have gone home and it is just you and the gradient. Entry 6. Lavenham, Suffolk. In South Suffolk, about 5 miles from Sudbury, a small medieval town of timber-framed houses that physically lean into the streets. Population around 1,700. To understand Lavenham, you have to understand that it was rich. Spectacularly, improbably rich. In 1524, on the back of the woolen cloth trade, its famous deep blue broadcloth, Lavenham blue, this little town was the 14th wealthiest place in all of England. It paid more in tax than the cities of York and Lincoln, which were many times its size. And then it collapsed. Cheaper, lighter cloth was being made in Colchester and abroad. Within 50 years, the boom was over. What followed was 200 years of poverty. This is the part that matters because the poverty is why Lavenham still exists. When you are rich, you knock down the old house and build a fashionable new one. When you are poor, you live in the old house because you cannot afford anything else. The grand merchant houses were divided up into cramped dwellings for large families. The magnificent Guildhall became a workhouse. Nobody had the money to modernise, and so nothing was modernised for 2 centuries by accident out of sheer hardship. By the time the town's fortunes recovered, somebody finally noticed that the medieval town nobody could afford to replace had become one of the best preserved medieval towns in Europe. There are now more than 300 listed buildings here. According to one account, when the townspeople did try to start pulling the old buildings down, the lord of the manor took them to court to stop them, so even the survival had a fight in it. The most famous house leans so dramatically it is simply called the Crooked House. Built in 1395, it twisted as its unseasoned timber dried, and it has been twisting, photogenically, for 600 years. The old nursery rhyme about the crooked man in the little crooked house is said to have been born here. The last train left Lavenham in 1967. The line is gone, and now the only way in is by road. The trade-off is the cruelty hidden in the beauty. Lavenham is perfect because Lavenham suffered. Every crooked beam you photograph survived because the family living under it was too poor to replace it. Preservation here was not a choice anyone made. It was a misfortune that lasted long enough to become a treasure. Entry 5. Carnforth, Lancashire. A small town in Lancashire, just off the M6, where the main West Coast Railway line meets the lines heading to Leeds and out to the Cumbrian coast. Population around 6,000. On paper, an unremarkable junction town, except that Carnforth stopped very precisely in 1945. In that year, the director David Lean came here to film Brief Encounter, the story of 2 people who meet by chance in a railway refreshment room and fall, hopelessly and respectably, in love. He needed a station that felt real, that felt like wartime England, and he needed one far enough from London to be safe from bombing, because the war was still on and filming had to be done at night, between 10 in the evening and 6 in the morning, so as not to disrupt the trains. The Ministry of War Transport pointed him at Carnforth, so the platform, the clock, the footbridge, they are in the film, and then the rest of the country moved on, and Carnforth did not. Someone catches a train here every day. This is still a working station, but the refreshment room has been restored to look exactly as it did in 1945. The same kind of room, the same period fittings, And it serves tea every day to people sitting in a film that came out 80 years ago. There is a heritage centre. The film plays on a loop in a tiny cinema. There is a 1940s weekend every year where the whole town dresses up and the decade comes back. Here is the documented twist, the thing the legend smooths over. The famous refreshment room scenes, the ones everyone pictures, were not actually shot in that room. Lean filmed the interiors at a studio because the real room did not suit him. The room you have tea in today was rebuilt lovingly to match a set that was itself a recreation. Carnforth is a real place faithfully restored to resemble a fictional version of itself, and that somehow makes it more haunting, not less. The trade-off is that you live in a town frozen at a single moment, and not even a real moment, but a cinematic one. The defining experience of Carnforth is two strangers saying goodbye forever on a cold platform in black and white. The town chose to preserve its most beautiful heartbreak and live inside it, on a loop with the kettle on. The pivot. Stop here for a second, because the list changes from this point. The first 4 towns were places that time forgot. Southwold, the rest of the country priced past. Clovelly, a cliff cut off from the road. Lavenham, poverty froze in place. Carnforth, a film pinned to 1945. In every case, something happened to the town. Survival was passive, luck, hardship, geography, accident. From here on, it is the opposite. These are the towns that looked the modern world dead in the eye and chose on purpose, by rule, by law, by stubbornness, not to change. The next 4 did not get left behind. They dug in. Entry 4. Frinton-on-Sea, Essex. On the Essex coast, hemmed in on 3 sides by the sea, the railway line, and the marshes. Population around 5,000, and no town in England has resisted the modern world more deliberately or more famously than this one. Start with the fact that did the rounds nationally. Until the year 2000, Frinton had no pub, none. Not because no one wanted one, but because it was effectively forbidden. When the town was developed as a genteel resort in the 1880s and 90s, the industrialist who shaped it, Richard Powell Cooper, simply ruled it out. No pier, no boarding houses, no public houses, quality only. And that rule held through 2 world wars, through the entire 20th century, until the Lock and Barrel finally opened its doors in 2000, an event so significant the brewery marked it by having a Spitfire fly over the town. And it was not only the pub. Frinton did not get a fish and chip shop until the 1990s, and even that felt to some residents like the beginning of the end. Then, there are the gates. For most of its life, the only way into Frinton's town centre was over a railway-level crossing with old wooden gates that were swung shut by hand by a man whenever a train came. By the 2000s, Network Rail wanted to replace them with automatic barriers, the way every other crossing in the country had been replaced decades earlier. Frinton would not have it. There was a 3-year campaign to save the gates. It became the subject of a national television documentary about the curious world of the town. In the end, Network Rail gave up arguing and simply came in the night, 2 o'clock on a Saturday morning, April 2009, and swapped the gates out under cover of darkness. The next morning, 100 people gathered to protest a level crossing. Someone lives here behind all of that right now. The trade-off is the most honest one on this list, because in Frinton the residents did it to themselves. The rules that keep the town genteel and quiet and frozen are not imposed from outside. They are the town's own idea of itself, defended for over a century. You do not happen to live in 1955 in Frinton, you voted for it. And the price of that vote is that the 21st century has to ask permission to come in and is usually told no. Entry 3. Stamford, Lincolnshire. In Lincolnshire, on the River Welland, a market town built almost entirely of honey-coloured limestone, population around 20,000. Sir Walter Scott called it the finest stone town in England, and that reputation has clung to it ever since. Stamford should, by every normal rule, have been swallowed by the modern world. It was a major town in medieval times, one of the great staging posts on the Great North Road, the main route from London to Edinburgh. But 2 things saved it. The Industrial Revolution largely passed it by. No mills, no factories, no smoke. And then the Great North Road, The very thing that had made it busy was rerouted away from the town, bypassed, left to itself. And a town that gets left to itself with no industry and no through traffic simply stops being rebuilt. The 17th and 18th century buildings stayed because nothing came along with enough money or reason to knock them down. Then, in 1967, came the move that made Stamford's preservation permanent. Parliament passed the Civic Amenities Act, which created an entirely new idea: the conservation area, a way of protecting not just individual important buildings, but whole streets, whole townscapes, the character of a place. And the very first conservation area designated in England and Wales, just 2 months after the Act passed, was Stamford, number 1, the original. There are now over 10,000 of them across the country, and Stamford was the seed. Today there are more than 600 listed buildings here, 5 medieval churches, a coaching inn, the George, dating from 1597 with a gallows sign that still spans the entire width of the road. The medieval street pattern is largely unchanged since the 13th century. Film crews come constantly, Middlemarch, Pride and Prejudice, because Stamford can play the 18th or 19th century without anyone having to hide a single thing. Someone lives here in those listed houses, doing the school run past the gallows sign. The trade-off is that you do not really own a house in Stamford. You hold it in trust. You cannot change a window, a door, a roof line without permission, because the whole town is a protected object, and your home is one cell of it. Stamford was the first town in the country to be legally frozen in time, and the residents live, every day, inside the rules that did the freezing. Entry 2. Rye, East Sussex. On the border of East Sussex and Kent, a medieval town built on a small hill, its cobbled streets slithering uphill between overhanging Tudor timber and Georgian brick. And the reason Rye still looks like this is one of the strangest reasons on the entire list. Rye was once one of the busiest ports in England. It was a cinque port, part of the medieval confederation of harbours that supplied the crown with ships. It sat on a rock with the sea on 3 sides, England's frontier, the bridge to continental Europe, a town that lived and breathed on the water at its feet. And then the sea left. Slowly, over centuries, the harbour silted and the coast pushed outward, and the water that had been right outside the door retreated and never came back. Today, the sea is about 2 miles away, and where the great port used to be, there is now farmland. The single thing that would have driven Rye to modernise, to expand, to industrialise, its harbour, its trade, its connection to the world, simply walked away 1 century at a time and left the medieval town stranded on its hill with no reason to change. Rye was not preserved by a rule or by poverty. It was preserved by the sea abandoning it. What it kept is extraordinary. Mermaid Street, a steep, cobbled lane lined with timber-framed houses, routinely called one of the most beautiful and most photographed streets in Britain. The houses have names instead of numbers, because numbers came later, and Rye never bothered. The house opposite, the house with 2 front doors, the house with the seat, and the Mermaid Inn with cellars dating to 1156, rebuilt in 1420 after French raiders burned the town to the ground in 1377. The legend here is the smugglers. In the 1730s and 40s, the Mermaid was a stronghold of the Hawkhurst gang, who ran contraband up from the coast and were so untouchable they would sit drinking in the bar with their loaded pistols laid out on the tables, daring anyone to interfere. The locals learned to mind their own business, to watch the wall while the gentleman went by, as the old smuggling rhyme has it. Historians are sceptical of some of the wilder tales about the tunnels beneath the streets. But the secret passages in the inn are real, the gang was real, and the executions that finally ended it in 1749 are a matter of record. The trade-off is that you live in a port with no port. Rye's entire reason for existing dissolved into farmland, and what was left behind is a perfect medieval town that the modern world never had a commercial reason to touch. You live in a place the sea forgot, and the forgetting is the only reason it is still this beautiful. Entry 1. Castle Combe, Wiltshire. In a wooded valley on the southern edge of the Cotswolds, about 12 miles from Bath, a single winding street of honey-coloured stone cottages following a stream down to a packhorse bridge. The population is around 350, and only about 50 people live in the village centre itself. It is, by near universal agreement, the prettiest village in England. But that is not why it is number one. This is why. No new house has been built in the historic heart of Castle Combe since around the year 1600. Read that again. Not since restrictions came in. Not since a conservation rule, since 1600. For over 4 centuries, the centre of this village has simply not added a single new building. What you see is what was there before Shakespeare died. And it goes further. There are no streetlights, no telegraph poles, no television aerials on any of the roofs. Every wire, every cable, the entire apparatus of the modern world has been buried underground so that nothing visible breaks the spell. Stand in the middle of Castle Combe and there is, quite literally, nothing in your eye line to tell you what century it is. This is why film studios come here again and again. Dr. Dolittle, Stardust, Warhorse, because it is the one place in England a director can point a camera in any direction and not have to hide anything. At the centre, where the 3 streets meet, stands a 14th century market cross with a little roof over it, raised when the village was granted the right to hold a weekly market in 1440. Beside it, the old village pump. Like Lavenham, Castle Combe was a wool village. Like Lavenham, it grew rich on cloth and then quietly declined when the industry moved north, and the decline again is what preserved it. There was no money and no reason to modernise, and so for 400 years it simply did not. There is a wonderful piece of history attached to the Dolittle filming in 1967, when the crew dammed the stream and built a fake jetty to turn the village into a seaport and drag the aerials off the roofs. The residents were so furious at what was being done to their village that there were acts of sabotage against the production, including reportedly by a young army officer named Ranulph Fiennes, who would later become one of the great explorers of the age. Even a Hollywood film could only borrow Castle Combe on the village's terms, and the village did not enjoy the loan. Someone lives here. This morning, in a cottage older than the United Kingdom itself, with no aerial on the roof and no streetlight outside the window, someone made coffee in a kitchen on a street that has not added a building since the reign of Elizabeth I. The trade-off is the weight of perfection. You cannot change anything. You cannot put up an aerial, cannot widen the lane, cannot, in any visible way, live in the present. Around 50 people share their home with the relentless tide of visitors who come to stand in the one place in England where the modern world was simply not allowed in. You do not live in Castle Combe so much as you keep it, for the cameras, for the tourists, for the 400 years of stillness that are watching to make sure you do not break the line. Synthesis. Why these 8 England has tens of thousands of towns, and the overwhelming majority of them modernised. They got the chains, the ring roads, the interchangeable high streets, and the reason most of them did is not sinister. It is ordinary. It is money and traffic and convenience and the slow, reasonable logic that says old things should make way for useful ones. So the question is not why most towns changed. The question is why these 8 did not. And there is no single answer. Southwold, the country priced past, until the absence of change became the most expensive thing about it. Clovelly was saved by a cliff and held by one family for 300 years. Lavenham was frozen by 2 centuries of poverty too deep to rebuild through. Carnforth pinned itself to a single night of filming in 1945. Frinton refused the modern world by rule and defended a level crossing as if it were a cathedral. Stamford was bypassed, then made permanent by being the first town in the country a new law thought worth protecting. Rye was abandoned by the very sea that built it, and Castle Combe simply stopped building around 1600 and never started again. 8 towns, 8 completely different mechanisms, but underneath all of them runs the same thread, and it is the thread this whole list was built around. In every one of these places, in every generation, someone decided that the town mattered more than the upgrade, more than convenience, more than money, more than the very reasonable modern argument that everywhere should be allowed to become like everywhere else. Sometimes that decision was a choice, made by a family or a council or a stubborn campaign. Sometimes it was made for them by a cliff or a silted harbour or an empty purse. But the result is the same. These places held the line. And so you can still stand in the middle of one of these streets, turn a full circle, and not find a single thing that tells you what decade you are standing in. No chain logo, no contactless sign, a butcher who is still a butcher, a cinema with an usherette, a kitchen in a cottage older than the printing press with the kettle on. People live there. They are not performing. It is just Tuesday. These towns are not remarkable because they are old. A ruin is old. They are remarkable because someone is inside them, right now, this morning, living the unhurried, inconvenient, beautiful life that the rest of the country quietly agreed to give up. If you have walked down one of these high streets, Mermaid Street in the rain, or the cobbles of Clovelly, or the stillness of Castle Combe at first light, and felt something you could not quite name, the weight of it, the silence of it, the sense of a place that simply decided not to move, tell me in the comments which town it was and what it made you feel. I want to know. And if this showed you an England you did not have before, not the one on the postcards, but the one that is still, quietly, switched on, consider subscribing. We cover the history that the surface level stuff skips, not because it is hidden, but because it only gives itself up to people willing to sit with it long enough to understand what it actually means.